Yeah.
All right, we're back here with Nate from NextGen. Nate, thanks for joining us again. Everybody loves it when you're on the show to discuss how bad transmissions are in all these new trucks. The first question I've got for you here today is up here on the banner. Has the latest generation of the valve body of the 10 speeds for the 1500 or the HD trucks in General Motors been improved with the 25s or the 2026s?
No. It has not been improved. So General Motors wants people to believe that the most current versions of these valve bodies are reliable and that they fixed everything that was wrong. And that is not true. So I sent you some of this media. I don't know how much of it's made it out to the public. I got a General Motors 10-speed so-called Gen 3 valve body, which for those who are unaware are the units that are most current, the ones that supposedly fix all the problems and all that fake news. We got one. We got one of the first ones out of production. And like I said, I sent you some videos of it. We disassembled it and it's nearly identical. And the few changes that they did make, as far as I'm concerned, have no significant impact on reliability. Now, the only major difference, and I wouldn't even label it major, in the Gen 3 valve body, if Chrysler would have done this, it would have just been the same valve body, just maybe an update, right? So keep in mind, the whole Gen 3 thing is marketing. They want people to think they fixed the problem, right? But the only meaningful difference is that they eliminated the low end feed limit valve. And this is the valve that was triggering the rear wheel lockup condition. I figured that out in 2021 and we told General Motors about it. And that's part of why we deleted them. We have the patent pending only delete kit for them. So General Motors discovered that that was triggering the rear wheel lockup condition. And so instead of just using our delete kit and not redesigning the valve body and complicating everybody's lives, they made their own valve body, which has every single other problem except the feed limit low valve because it's now eliminated from the valve body. Every single other problem is still there. So overpressurization from failure of the LPC piston, a part that we delete, right? Still there. TCC dampener shutter, still there. Once again, we delete it, right? For example, the shift valves warping and getting stuck and triggering P2700 complex and P0700 complex fault codes. Still not fixed. We have the only fix, as usual. On the Allison side of the house, the manual valves, the part that connects to the park reverse neutral drive switch and shift lever, there's still aluminum. There's still no mill cut in them. They still snap the heads off. That's a documented problem. So a lot of stuck in drive or stuck in reverse scenarios are caused by that failure. Again, we have the only fix, right? So they just simply didn't fix the valve body. That's General Motors lying to the public again, in my opinion, and they can sue me.
So a question about, so if you see something like this, a 2025 Silverado 2500, and I see complaints like this in NHTSA, this is on January 7th of 2025. So these were before they upgraded, before they got rid of this transmission rear wheel lockup thing, right? So that in theory, maybe like midway through 2025, the rear wheel lockup's gone, but then all the other issues are still there.
Correct. So the rear wheel lockup issue, the conditions that trigger that failure no longer exist in the valve body. Now, every other problem is still there. So that's the only meaningful difference. And to be honest, the rear wheel lockup can still happen. It would just happen through different mediums. So when I discovered what was causing the rear wheel lockup, I discovered that it was a failure in the low reverse, or excuse me, in the feed limit low circuit, where the valve bore was eroding. And it was allowing the cross-pollination of oil to unseat a check ball from the separator plate that was triggering a bind-up condition inside the unit. I figured that out. That's why I deleted the valves, right? Given that fact, General Motors also recognizes that that's what was triggering the problem. And so their solution was to redesign the valve body. But what I find shocking is that that's a radical waste of money. Like, it had to have been cheaper to just call us and we would just license the fix to them. So I think that this is exemplar of General Motors being, in my opinion, both incompetent and malicious at the same time. Because even if you're trying to be greedy, you would have just licensed the fix from us. Like, General Motors knows exactly who NextGen Drivetrain is. They're very, very, very aware. Believe me, we've talked to some pretty high people there. We know all about it. So when I see them spending all this money to redesign the valve body, when it would have been quite much literally cheaper to take people to dealerships and install the feed limit delete kit, okay, at the dealership level, That would have saved them millions and millions and millions of dollars, and they didn't do it. So, like, do I think that they're cheap, and do I think that their conduct is malicious at times? I think it's bad faith behavior. I absolutely do. But I think that this is an example of General Motors just being generally incompetent, as they are every other day of the year.
And regarding that, so when I see stuff like this, I saw this in the groups recently. This guy's on his second valve body failure. So to me, and this is in December of 25, and then of course someone says, get the next gen valve body upgrade. Is this just everything else in the valve body? This has got to be the Gen 3, I would assume. If he's on his second valve body failure, he's probably got the latest generation valve body as a replacement already.
Sure. Most likely, if it's an Allison, that would not be the case. If it's the smaller General Motors 10-speed, it would be. There is no Gen 3 Allison 10-speed valve body. I guess, well, let me correct that. There is a third change that they have now made, but all of the parts are almost totally interchangeable. And so I wouldn't really consider it a new generation. I would consider it to just be a slight tweak to an existing product. It's not like the new one where many of the parts don't interchange on the General Motors 10-speed side. The other thing I would say is, some people asked us how we got a valve body upgrade kit out for the third generation valve body in like 20 days. Like, well, how did you do that? Well, because it's all the same parts. We had to cut a different separator plate for it and then just tweak which springs come in the kit. And that was it. That's all it took. We put it in one. It worked perfectly. We drove it around for a little bit to make sure that it worked correctly. And we moved on with our day. I mean, this is not new. I think that General Motors is dusting their trail because when inevitably the lawyers get involved, I believe what they would like to do is be able to mitigate the value of the tort by going in front of a judge and saying, look at all the things we tried to do to mitigate this problem. That's what I believe they're doing. I think that this is a giant liability play, and I think they're just playing politics. I believe that General Motors is a radically dishonest company. I'm very passionate about that. I have no questions about it. After seeing how they behaved with the whole 10-speed situation, it's embarrassing. I mean, they just lied to everybody about everything the whole way. So what, I'm supposed to believe you guys now? Sorry, no, I don't. So I wish that I saw better conduct, but unfortunately, I don't think it's going to change. And I understand they have to protect their shareholders. They're their only real customers. I get it. But the issue is that you can be a profit-centric organization and not on people. And that's what's so frustrating, is that some of this stuff that they do actually probably costs more money than they save. Like redesigning the valve body to not have a low end feed limit valve, when we could have licensed the fix to them for almost nothing. Yeah, I mean, you're spending more money than you would have spent just not being terrible people. And so it's really like macroeconomic leadership malpractice. I just think it's totally dishonest. No one's perfect. No executive is perfect. No company is perfect. No board is perfect. I'm not perfect. My staff aren't perfect. I get all that. The issue is when you behave so recklessly and with such lack of goodwill, in my opinion, that it really just becomes ridiculous. And that's why thousands of customers were down all over the country, a huge portion of which NextGen Drivetrain remobilized, not General Motors.
Is this the best use for their transmissions now? Just to sync?
Why not? Why not? Skincare.
Yeah, right. So then that brings me to the next question I get a lot. Is the 8-speed found in the mid-size trucks? I mean, they sell a lot of mid-size trucks, and the Silverado 1500 with the 2.7 has the 8-speed. Is that valve body changed?
So the 8-speed used behind the 2.7 is called the 8L80E. This is an evolution of the previous generation, which had two versions, the 8L45 and 8L90, both E for electronic. The 8L80 is nearly identical in almost every way. Similar to the change between the Gen 2 and Gen 3 valve body, so they say, from General Motors. So they say there's only slight changes. And between the 8L90 and the 8L80, there are only slight changes. But the architecture is almost totally identical. So with the 8L80, the only change from the 8L90 is they changed some of the dimensions in the valve body of the valves, the springs, things like that. The separator plates are different. One of them at least is different. But the parts material is the same. The quality is the same. The operating pressure is almost the same. Again, we invented the industry's only pulse dampener delete kit. Well, those pulse dampeners are the cause of the vast majority of General Motors 8-speed transmission failures, both in the 8L45 and 90, but also the 8L80. So once again, this is a situation where they could have very easily made this stuff more reliable. They could have very easily eliminated components that just don't need to be there. So for somebody at home watching this who maybe doesn't know how a transmission works, let's take an engine. And let's say we add a part to that engine, a moving part that just doesn't do anything. But when it breaks, you have to rebuild the engine. Well, you don't need to be an engineer to be like, well, that's stupid. Like, why don't you just design it without the parts so that we don't risk the part failing, right? Well, every engineer knows that. There's a generalized belief in the engineering community that if you can compress two parts into one in a moving part system, you do it because you make it simpler, right? Like, why do with two batteries what you can do with one larger battery, right? Some people disagree, but that's generally how things work. When you eliminate these moving parts, you eliminate things that can fail. Well, that's why when I started designing parts to make the 8-speed GM reliable, the first thing I thought is, how can I eliminate these pulse dampeners that are the cause of nearly all their problems? And so I designed a kit that eliminates, if I remember correctly, it's like 14 or 16 moving parts from the valve body, nearly all of which are the most common wear components. Of course, you're eliminating this pulsation system that triggers so many valve bore issues because it's cycling the valves all the time. You're eliminating that, but you're also eliminating a part of the valve body that's prone to flexing and leaking with a billet aluminum replacement that doesn't do that. So this is all stuff that could easily be done. I mean, when you're talking millions of vehicles, can be done for dollars. Okay. Like, we do production runs in the scale of hundreds to thousands. General Motors could do them in millions. So the reality is they could push the price down to almost nothing and give all the parts that we design to these customers. And the products would be radically more reliable. But there's a reason they don't do that. And it's because there is so much money in service, repair, and maintenance. And so they understand that if they continuously design parts that fail, the moment the warranty is over, they now have an income source rather than a liability because they don't have to pay for it under warranty. The warranty's done. They get to bill you for the repair. And if you're like, well, that's fine. I won't go to General Motors for my transmission repair. I think it's a ripoff. It was a garbage product. Okay, you can go somewhere else, but 95% of what you're going to get in even the most aftermarket of aftermarket transmissions is stock parts. And guess who's going to sell them? It's going to be General Motors. So you're really married to these companies, even if you don't want to transact through their ecosphere. And I just think it's a dishonest business model. And so, in my opinion, this is why you need to take repairability into your own hands. When you're not able to repair something, I would assume logically you don't own it. That's why my firm focuses on right to repair products. That's why everything we do is designed so that the end user can install it. All these kits for your transmission that upgrade them are designed to be installed at home, is because we cannot allow, and this is my philosophical belief around this topic, and I think it's important to communicate, we cannot allow the company that makes your car or truck monopolize your ability to repair it. Because if that's the case, then you didn't buy the truck from them, you just paid for the truck. And I think that that's morally criminal behavior. And I think General Motors is a very lucid example of this.
Yeah, they're going to leverage software to do that more and more and more. That's how they're going rapidly. Is they'll start to create such a dependency on software systems in cars that even the repairability of the mechanical pieces, like what you're doing, will be very difficult in the future. I think it's just terrible.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of this software exists solely to make sure that the average person can't work on their car. So, I mean, there's relearns for so many different parts of a car now. And for anybody at home who's like, what's a relearn? So, a relearn is an electronic process, usually performed with a high-end scan tool, a computer, that you plug into your vehicle to read its computers. A relearn is a process where you reset those systems. It's a hard reset for a component. And some components require a relearn to be done. Some examples would be a transmission, a turbocharger, for BMW people for some reason, a throttle valve, things like that. And this relearn is nothing more than the factory hogging your information. And now people would be like, well, Nate, what are you talking about? Relearn is important to reset, the shift points or whatever. That is partly true. Some components don't need a relearn and nothing bad's going to happen. General Motors says if you don't relearn the valve body, that's the end of that transmission. It'll burn up right away. Well, we've got thousands of valve bodies out there with no relearns. So that sounds like fake news. And it sounds like I've proven it thousands of times. So some people think that I'm, pompous or full of myself. But how would you feel if an entity that big told you were wrong every day of your life while you prove thousands of times over that they're wrong? I mean, how is that supposed to make somebody feel? So, this is one of the only forums I have to communicate my position. So, the reality is that that's just not accurate. That's fake. You don't need a relearn for a huge portion of things. And a lot of people who say, well, you do need a relearn for a valve body, we did it thousands of times. So if you need a relearn for a valve body, I would be curious how many of those events are underfill situations or transmissions where the previous valve body was so damaged that a relearn is necessary because all of the learn data is so far from center mass, like the middle of the data group, that it's now not behaving appropriately. Like there are variables there, but the reason it's a data mining scam is because a lot of relearn data is sent to the OEMs. This is the same logic behind pun and ton information with Ford and General Motors. It is my personal opinion that it's a giant data mining operation because what they're doing is they're plotting failure data based on VIN number. And that's why you have to go, and this is not a conspiracy. I know somebody at Ford, like this is just a, in my opinion, I'm just going to tell you that they're plotting failure data using pun and ton codes. It's a giant scam, in my opinion. What they're doing is they make you connect to Wi-Fi, obviously, and they're transmitting this information to the OEM using their proprietary software. Even if you use like an Autel or a Snap-on scanner, that software is licensed from who owns the software, and those software rights are owned by these OEMs, and they're collecting information on your transmission failure, your water pump failure, your throttle body failure, and they're doing it through pun and ton systems. And so when you're doing a relearn or an adaptive reset, a lot of times you're actually just telling the OEM, hey, here's my VIN, my transmission failed, use this data however you do. And that is once again a generally dishonest business model, and I think they owe people that information. This is why if you can't repair your own vehicle, you don't own it. When you can't fix your own car, you're the product, not the owner.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sad, man. Perfect segue into this question because I was going to ask you this. So I've heard this from a lot of other YouTubers, other people in the industry. They tell me supply chains are essentially too complex. GM couldn't possibly like fix their 6.2 liter crankshaft issues by building their own crankshaft or their own valve bodies in house and actually just raising the quality a little bit. What do you think about that? Is it going to raise cost of trucks too much if they actually just did the right thing, and at least with the powertrain components?
Anyone who believes that is lying or stupid, and I'm going to prove it. So that's insane. That's actually crazy. So I'm going to prove it. You can't make a valve body in-house because it would push the price up. NextGen Drivetrain is like 1,000th the size of General Motors. And we make our own valve body in-house. And people are like, oh, yeah, but yours is more expensive. No, if we had to make millions of them, they would be cheaper. So that makes zero sense. And the other thing is it would cost more money to make a crankshaft in-house. Well, then how did they do it for all those years at a lower price? Like, it doesn't make logical sense. If they can't make a crankshaft in-house for less money than somebody else can, then how does somebody else do it? I mean, there's companies that are ran out of a garage that make crankshafts. They don't have the capital GM does. They don't have the access to labor GM does. And they don't have the overseas connections GM does because GM is intimated with China. Look it up. So that is so false. And here's where that lie came from. It came from the OEMs. They've been telling people forever, oh, it's driving up prices. We can't bring this stuff in-house. We have to outsource it. That's total BS. General Motors could buy a warehouse full of screw machines right now. Okay, I just spent 500 on a screw machine. I know all about them. Okay, we did a video on it, right? They could buy a warehouse full of them right now and make all their own valves for cents a piece because they're using the cheapest aluminum money can buy. They could make them for pennies on the dollar. And they could have valves that are perfect every time. And they wouldn't have to pay companies like McLean Fog to make them. Okay, you can Google them. That's insane. General Motors can make this stuff for cheaper than anybody because they have the buying power, they have the labor access, they're the big company. The more resources you have, the further you can push down price. And General Motors has more resources than any mom and pop shop or any random foundry overseas or anything else. They're a massive corporation. That is not true. OEMs say things like that to make you comfortable with overspending on a vehicle at one of their franchisees. That's it. It is a lie propagated by the automotive industry. I promise you. I know so many people that work in marketing in this industry. It's just a lie. They want to make people comfortable with overspending. So they come up with all these ridiculous excuses for why they have to overcharge you. And then they'll take those excuses and they'll run media campaigns with it. Like they'll have like fake AI accounts on like X and Facebook and Instagram. You don't think big companies are making fake Facebook accounts and peddling propaganda? Of course they are. How many Amazon's been caught doing this multiple times? This happens in the automotive world all the time. There are companies that sell these services overseas. They're like, we'll flood the internet with good information about you if you pay us. And most of them are in China. Look it up, fact check me. It's not a conspiracy. So much of what you see on the internet in the automotive industry is just not true. It's propaganda. And a lot of it is bot farms in other countries trying to manipulate you through propaganda. The future of propaganda is social media, mark my words. And the automotive industry has figured this out already. I'm telling you, this industry is dirty. And you can't trust the OEMs when they say things like that. Nobody can make a connecting rod cheaper than a multi-gazillion dollar international corporation that has access to everything on earth. If you think General Motors can't make a connecting rod for less than some tiny little foundry somewhere, then you just need to take a class on economics. That is just simply not true. General Motors can make the stuff for cheaper.
So in the case of, I look at the 6.2 liter V8, which is having all sorts of crankshaft issues, like 2026s are dying. They'll get a replacement crate engine in them and they'll die in like 2,400 miles again. That's like the most ridiculous stories you've ever seen, right? It's never really been this bad with General Motors. And you look at the problems, and they've tried to, some third parties like Dave's Auto Center and other people have tried to diagnose, like, is it the crankshafts are just out of spec that far? And then GM saying, well, if they're really out of spec, we'll do 0W40 oil. But if they're throwing codes, we're going to replace your engine. And then now there's a new investigation where National Highway Traffic and Safety is basically saying, well, neither of the two solutions from GM fix the problem. Their crate engines aren't even good. Like, to me, that just screams like, even if you didn't replace or upgrade all the other pieces of the vehicle, like the electronics, all the things that can go bad, if you just focused on the heart, right, the engine and the transmissions, how much do you think it would really cost them to build just solid powertrains, just the engine and transmission?
Yeah, well, so there's two major problems. One is regulatory compliance, and the other one is cost. So, as far as regulatory compliance, these engines are so complicated because they can't just make an LS1 anymore. You know, you have to make variable valve timing. You have to make all these emissions compliant devices. Like, regulations have made vehicles so complicated that it becomes a non-competitive market. You have this small cadre of companies that get to abuse everybody. If you're a guy in a garage who's good at fabricating and good at making small engines, and you want to make a car someone can drive, and you want to sell it for 10,000 bucks, and maybe it doesn't have an airbag, maybe it's not fancy, but it's a car and it drives and it goes 50, 60 miles an hour. You can't do that. There's too many regulations. It's a red tape industry. So you have all these regulatory pressures making vehicles be unreliable because they keep inventing new systems that you have to create and augment these engines with. And so that makes it very difficult to make anything reliable in the common era, because emissions compliance and regulatory compliance writ large have become such a large part of the automotive community that people really can't just make something that works anymore. If they wanted to sell something that works, they would have never gotten rid of the LS3. So that's the first problem. The second problem, I say, is cost. Well, they say the problem is cost, but I kind of disagree. And I'll walk through that. So Toyota made a 10-cylinder engine in the mid 2000s. And in fact, it was made by Lexus under Toyota, of course. And this is one of the most reliable engines ever put in a sports car. And it's the engine inside the Lexus LFA. I've never in my life, and I understand there's only so many of those made, but hear me out. I'm very confident that none of them just arbitrarily like snapped a crankshaft. Well, they made enough of them to where if that was a known problem with the vehicle, at least one of them would have had it happen, right? So how did we get around these issues? Well, when Lexus would manufacture the engine, they would have an engineer who inspected every engine at multiple points along the way, right? And Nissan, when they were doing the GTR's engine, the exact same thing. And so they had these people whose job was to make sure that everything was done correctly. Well, General Motors has this, and it's just called quality control. The issue is that they clearly are not doing their job. So if they were, we wouldn't be having these issues. You know, if you think about it, this all has to be a function of complexity. But as far as cost, why can't General Motors implement a system similar to what Lexus was doing? Well, why can't they do that? Well, I can only logically assume that they can and they don't feel like paying somebody. And they say, okay, well, we're not, that's expensive. That's going to cost a lot of money. What did you spend replacing all those 6.2s?
Right.
Is a couple of eggheads in the factory 24 hours a day more expensive than however many thousands or tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds?
That's what I wonder. That's exactly what I wonder.
Like this is what I'm saying. They will step over $1 to pick up a penny every time. And I saw this happen with us. We wanted to license them the fix for the rear wheel locking up recall after we invented it, and they didn't care. But yet they went and redesigned the valve body just for it to still fail. Well, why wouldn't you just take the licensing deal? We would have done it for dirt cheap. Like, I own the company, man. Like I would have licensed it for a generous amount of money and I would have never bothered them again. But instead, they'd rather spend, it's got to be dozens, if not over 100 times that, fixing valve bodies and transmissions that are defective and litigating with lemon cases and buybacks with frustrated customers. They know that they have to do that. So the reality is that they're not even good stewards of their own capital. And that's why I say when the shareholder is the only true customer, they don't even treat them properly. Like, can you imagine being an investor in GM and realizing that another company offered them a fix to a problem for millions and millions of dollars cheaper than they were going to try and fix it for? And they were like, no, thanks, we're going to redesign this and make it fail again. I'd be upset. So it's a lot of incompetence and a lot of malice at the same time.
They got rid of the one problem that National Highway Traffic and Safety cares about, which it was the only problem that they will get investigated for, which is the rear wheel lockup. Everything else is like, well, if it gets through warranty and it shifts terribly and it fails at 100 or 130,000 miles, NHTSA doesn't care about that.
So NHTSA may not care about that, but the civil court system does. And so this is one of the many reasons NHTSA is a sham organization, is because they don't do their job. Like, look at how many issues these transmissions have had. And they're just worried about some of them having a rear wheel locking up issue. If I worked at NHTSA, I would have recalled every vehicle that documented this problem in more than just a one scenario, right? Like, if a dozen people have called us with a Cadillac ATS with this problem, I'm going to include it in the recall. I don't really care if it's outside of the year window, right? Like, that's just obvious. Like, somebody with no education would recognize that pattern, right? So the NHTSA is just so corrupt because everyone that works there they are imposed in that position by bureaucrats who are appointed by politicians whose campaigns are funded by racketeering and extortion organizations like the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, that's how I would describe them in my own opinion, whose entire job is to take money from their members, which would be companies like, Ford, GM, Toyota, all them, and then give that money to politicians as bribes, or as I would call them, or excuse me, as they would call them, campaign contributions. The word is bribes, all right? And so you have this like circle, this like, whirlpool where money floats around and results in the protection of these companies. Now, NHTSA can't just not do anything. So they only honor the most extraordinary, ridiculous, and insane examples of something being unsafe. Pretty much to the point where people would litigate if they didn't. That's the only time they get involved. This is why people need to lawyer up. Take this into the civil court system. Say, this is what my vehicle's doing. Like, I took a video of it. Look how unsafe this is to drive. Punish them in an environment where a court can figure out what your damages are worth. Don't ask NHTSA to help you because they're not going to. NHTSA has no record of making the world a safer place compared to the civil court system. That's why if you have a vehicle that is unsafe to drive, you lemon it. You lemon it.
I still think people should complain to them. I still think it's the only public aggregation of data we have. It's just, like you said, it's the only way we have to trigger any change or have data, because we can't get that data unless NHTSA puts it out, right? Like the complaint data, the investigation data, none of it, the manufacturers just hide it until they're investigated. But on the same token, like you said, you'll see the exact same transmission or the exact same engine, like in the case of the Toyota Tundra, where you've got a 22, 23, 24, 25, they're all failing the same way, yet they only force them to recall up to the previous model year so that they can continue selling the current model years and the leftovers. It's like they're always a year or a year and a half behind, even though they have the data and the complaints. They still allow, they don't want them to have a stop sale on it.
Well, that's because NHTSA is a kangaroo court environment. I mean, it's deeply corrupt, and like those are their friends. Yeah, you're going to tell your friends they can't sell the new cars. I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. NHTSA has a very long history of not caring about highway safety. In fact, IIHS cares about highway safety way more than NHTSA. And IIHS is a private organization that, as far as I'm concerned, it's a group ran by insurance companies with the intent of decreasing the liability exposure of selling policies while they continue to charge more for premiums. Like that's what IIHS is. But it's proof that when you put the government in charge of these systems, they just fail. IIHS is ran by private industry. That's what it is. They're a vestigial organization of insurance companies. Well, insurance companies don't want to pay out a lot in crashes. Like that's the opposite of how they make money, right? So they're like, well, how do we make the vehicles safer? And so IIHS was created by insurance companies to study how to make vehicles safer so that they could insure cars like that more preferably. And so that automakers could make the cars safer and work with insurance companies so that everybody made more. So IIHS, even though they're pretty corrupt, in my opinion, has done so much more, so much more. Think about this. Private insurance companies have done so much more to make you safe driving a car than the literal organization the government owns to make it safe for you to drive a car.
Yeah.
It's really radical, and it's proof that organizations like this just don't do their job.
One more question about the valves, I think. Essentially, a guy that asks in the groups if NextGen is still the best fix for valve bodies, and then someone responded, Ronnie Butler says, yes, if you want all of the issues corrected as of now. He said he would stay with the stock shift valves, though, because he wasn't sure if NextGen got them perfected, so it might give you an opportunity to speak about your new machine.
Sure. So I think what the gentleman's question was is in reference to product recall. I think it's the only one that we ever had, to be honest. We recalled a product before too many of them got out there. I think it was like 15 or 20 kits, which obviously we wish it was 0 kits, but it was like 15 or 20. And what we discovered was that the shift valves on General Motors vehicles, not the Ford ones, even though they're the same design, the General Motors shift valves had to be within tolerances that were kind of just insane. Like you're talking 10 thousandths of an inch. And they needed this because the amount of pressure that turns them off is so low. And on most of them, and on all of the test vehicles we had, we discovered that their software allowed for slightly more pressure to turn these valves off. And so we had never ran into a situation where some of them didn't have that much pressure because the computer did not petition the system for it. And so we discovered eventually that there were a string of these vehicles out there, and we were lucky to catch this problem early on and give those people refunds or credits or whatever we had to do to just make sure they were happy. And so what we did is we halted the product for about 3 months. And 2 specific part numbers of product were no longer sold for those 2 or 3 months. And this was while we figured out that that was the problem. Well, we discovered about a month in that that was the issue. We had ascertained a test vehicle, and this was what all of my time and effort went into for about 3 weeks. And we altered all the drawings, and we discovered that in order to hold tolerances that tight, we can't use a typical like 5-axis lathe. We have to use a Swiss lathe, which is a screw machine. And I had recently purchased one at this time. Well, that screw machine got here right around that time. And so our priority was to get it up and running on these valves that required the even tighter tolerances than we hold on other valves. Now, the tolerances we hold on valves are already at or above OEM spec. But we discovered on these specific valves that it had to be truly ridiculous, like again in tenths. The window is less than half of a thousandth of an inch on these valves. So when we got this screw machine that we now have in house to make these at this tolerance in our building, they were the first valves we focused on because they were the ones that couldn't be done on the 5-axis lathe. And so we didn't sell the product until we knew that we had fixed that little problem that we identified. So after making sure that, that 15 to 20 customers was taken care of, we had tested these products really aggressively because we were like frantic. We're like, look, there's a lot of focus on us. And I'm just being honest. Like, there's a lot of limelight on us as a company because we became really popular during the whole General Motors 10-speed debacle. We have to get this right. So we probably could have got the valves back. We could have started fulfilling orders again on those two part numbers probably pretty quickly, but we didn't because we didn't want to send something out and have an issue again. We were very concerned about that. So we actually worked really closely with one of our largest dealers, which is No Zone Diesel, who's an amazing, amazing, amazing company that focuses on building upgraded General Motors 10-speed transmissions. And I don't like, they're not a sponsor of ours or anything. I know the owner personally, and I've seen some of the highest quality work in the automotive industry. And they only use our parts, and I believe in what they do. So I called them. I reached out to them and said, hey, I really want to test these. We ran into this issue. It's only on some vehicles, but we can't risk this. We think we have this permanently resolved. We have like 300 orders we got to fill, so we got to test this quickly. But we need to make sure it's correct. And so we made them on the screw machine with the refined tolerances that were much, much, much tighter. And we tested them aggressively, and we got everything dialed into where it has to be. And once we knew that even if you had the lower pressure software, you were going to run perfectly. Once we knew, and we had testing that it was correct, we continued fulfillment of that item. And we discovered that everything was perfect. No one ever had that issue again, ever. So we're very, very proud of it. And we couldn't have done that without our screw machine. So screw machines are a very extraordinary, expensive type of lathe. So I'll save people the nerd talk, but basically, their incentive is tolerance. They can hold tolerances that a 5-axis lathe simply could never hold. And it was one of the best investments we ever made in this company. And it now every single valve, not just shift valves for 10-speed GMs, every single valve is manufactured at a scale of 10 thousandths of an inch tolerance, which is totally insane. And we want to make sure that we're the best company on the planet for valve body upgrades. And it became empirical that we needed a screw machine. So we bought one. So to answer that person's question, not only is there not a single way that we could spend money on as a company to make them any tighter quality than they currently are, we now have tens of thousands of valves out there since the only recall we've ever had, with such a high success rate that we're now considering buying another screw machine. So I really respect and honor that they have those questions. And you know what? I think that one recall out of 10 years in doing business, and it affected 15 to 20 customers, not more than 25. I think on that specific item, I think those are really, really, really respectable odds. And I'm proud of what my staff do, and I'm proud of what we do. And we learned enough from it to where I'm confident that will never happen again for the balance of time I run this company. So I'm really glad they asked, and I'm glad I get to clear that up for everybody.
Awesome, man. So you still stand by, last little question before we go here, still stand by Ram ZF as the best transmission on the market?
No doubt about it. Yeah, so that transmission's not perfect. I did a video about that and people got triggered and offended. But I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying like it's competing against the 10R140 and the 10-speed Allison. Well, those are garbage transmissions. You know, the Powerline 8 is who the 10L1000 and 10R140 were trying to copy. So the Powerline 8's the real deal. I'm very impressed with the Powerline 8. It's not perfect. Sometimes it vibrates a little. I mean, like, we're going to install our pulse dampener delete kit in that soon, and then that'll never happen again. But it's so much better than the 210L, 10R. It's so much better than those products that, yeah, I absolutely stand by it. Yeah, correct.
Awesome. Anything else you want to say?
Yeah, General Motors is lying to the public again, in my opinion, and people should not buy a new car.
All right, man. Thanks for coming on. Everyone will appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks. Have a good day.